Hello, hello, hello. This is Silas, and I'm here with Steven. Introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone.
We're back for our series of conversations, and this one we're discussing the book Cynical Theories, right?
Correct. By
And
James Bizey and Helen Pluckrose.
yeah, so it's a series on that. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to break it up into different parts. But it's in general a discussion about critical theory, about postmodernism, and just the effect that it's had in society. And we find it to be an important topic. I think a lot of you, good chances if you're watching this video, you're aware of some of these topics and some of these things. But it's involved all over the world. Even if you're not completely aware from the highest levels, there's now I think there's a lot of stories in the United States of America of is it government officials, entire ministries or departments having to go to certain lessons and teachings based on this. What else do you think is a practical example of how this is affecting people, even if they don't necessarily know the actual definitions of the content?
Well, it's showing up in elementary school curricula as well. I've posted a number of things on that. Like you say, federal agencies, but also some companies are requiring it now as part of their training. Um, of course, there's a lot of debate on this about how many are deeply committed to it versus how many are sort of using it to shield themselves from lawsuits so they can say,
Yes.
oh, that we teach our employees to behave this way, so don't come after us.
Yeah. It's in international organizations,
Yeah.
and I'll try to find some examples of seeing it moving out to uh, outside of the Western. I mean, it's outside of the Westernized world, I'd say, because I'm in recording this from Kenya, and there are some issues like I'm starting to see, like, oh, this celebrity finally comes out and she's part of the LGBTQ plus thing, and now that might go through in a different lens depending on how people view those kind of relationships in Kenya with the traditional ways and the older pre-colonial times. And that's a bit of a foreshadowing of
Yeah.
one of the topics we're going to be talking about here with post-colonial theory. But we'll get to that. But just trying to think about that, how different are these things in different places? Like, can some of these things catch on in a place like Saudi Arabia, or do they catch on in a place like Nairobi because it's had that colonial influence of being a British colony back in the time? So there's different things to kind of think about with this.
Did you see what happened in Scotland recently with Hume
No.
Tower?
Oh yeah, I saw that, but that turned out to be. I don't think they necessarily named it. It was George Square or something. It wasn't
George
a.
Place.
I don't think it was named after George Floyd, because
No.
the early reports I saw it was actually after George Floyd. I think it was caught up. It's something done in the fervor that came after the George Floyd incident, but I don't think that name was chosen as a nod to George Floyd.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, the story for those who haven't heard about it, there's a school in Scotland that named it was like a dormitory complex, a big apartment complex or something,
Yeah.
and it was named after David Hume, and of course now they're going back in time and finding problematic individuals and things with the people back then, because despite what you think, you are living in the most civilized and best time to be alive in society. We are in general more moral and more ethical on the basic definitions of those terms than any other time in history.
Yeah.
So 2020 is not the worst year ever; it's the best year ever. That's just something. It's kind of frustrating that people bringing that over. So, but anyway, they're going back and taking our current morality, our current standards, and selectively applying it to people in the past, and then unpersoning them, canceling them, which is kind of it's something that's been done by certain kind of people with certain kind of kind of ideologies,
Yeah.
Marxism. But so there has been some things with that unpersoning where there's those traditional photos of just taking out of Stalin walking down on the beach and then like just taking out people from that image. That's one of the key images, right? One
Yeah.
of the key situations that happened. Who was the person taken out? Do you remember the actual particular person?
I don't remember the name. I just remember it was taken along a river, and that was done to a number of people, including some people who had been higher up and loyal, who had been loyal and had been even higher up. I didn't know this till recently, but I was watching the death of Stalin, and I learned that Molotov was going to be purged, and he was foreign minister. He was through World War II and everything, and he was going to be killed because he was suspected of disloyalty. So nobody was safe ultimately.
And this is the thing that I think, again, going back to the whole we are living in the best time, realize that this didn't start with Stalin. The only reason it seems to have started with him is because he just happened to be one of the people in power during the time when they were photographs. In the past, there weren't any photographs of the people who were against the royals and the monarchs and the rulers. They would just get unpersoned. They would just get disappeared. The general public would never even know these people existed. Like it used to be for your life. So when we see the politicians, why is this politician not saying this? Why is this politician not doing that? Realize the stakes that some of these people live and exist in. It comes from a tradition where it was literally your life, like your direct life. If you fail at this, you are done. Like the whole transition of power type of that wasn't the situation. It was to death. The power switched hands when you died. That's how things used to be, and that's how the actual scales and the that was the risk. That was the risk of some of these people going. That's what people were playing with, and I'm glad to live in a time when I can come and record these videos, have this conversation with Stephen, talk about certain topics that some people might not like, some people with more power than us, some people with less power than us. We could go on and tweet whatever kind of filth, floor, and filth we want to do to Donald Trump, who's technically one of the most powerful people in the world. We can literally just open our phones right now, go to his Twitter, and just say all these things to him. And then some people are trying to say like this is a time where there's so much danger and so much. No, that's a magnificent state of affairs. This is something that is rather exceptional to be living in a time like this, and which is why I encourage you guys, if you're watching this, thanks for coming to watch this. Try to have these conversations with people in your life. Engage with us in the comment section. Look around you, and I think you will find that speaking out, it might be a little scary before, and maybe there's some kind of genetic in our ideology, in our society kind of nature to have that past memory of if you went against this, you would die. Chances are, if you talk about some of these topics, ask questions about some of the things we're talking about here, you're not going to be killed.
No.
So try to do that and see if that leads to a better life.
Sure.
Okay, so opening up, I'm going to just read this thing. It's something that was reviewed from the book that Stephen shared with me that I thought was rather important to put out. And this is going to serve as kind of a foundation or an operating system or a lens of how to approach some of the content that we're talking about here. And this is also just to see, like, when we talk about postmodernism, this is going to be the postmodern principles and themes. This is something someone wrote from the book, the Critical Theories book. So when we talk about certain things here, when we mention postmodernism, this is what we mean. This is what we're thinking, what we have in mind. And I suggest that if you disagree with some of the content that's in this short list that I'm going to read, this definition kind of things, you can let us know why you think that is not a part of it or why we should add something else. If you're thinking about something else that is not in this, and that might be why you feel something we mention later on is off, because you might be talking about something that we don't necessarily consider to be part of postmodernism, or that can be an entirely different thing. So, and you can make the case that we could be wrong about what we're talking about, or you're correct. We're open to that. Anything else on that?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay. So I'll just start off here. The postmodern principles and themes. The postmodern knowledge principle. Radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism.
Right.
The postmodern political principle. A belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how. So that's to me, like, that just sounds like, reality exists outside of the systems of power, and like the hierarchies and things. I think, as we had mentioned before, they're the ones that set up certain punishments and conditions, terms and conditions of dealing with reality. I think that's what they do, but I think the society.
Well, they decide. Well, as far as the truth claims, it has to do with the belief is that the people in power decide how we decide what's true. That's one of their criticisms against reason, against science, all that, as we'll get into.
Now, this goes to the whole thing as from the anarchist, and not in the sense that Donald Trump and other people are using the term, which I just don't want to use that term anymore. It's just been so bastardized. Where you can have, I think you can have a society without, and you see here they say systems of power and hierarchies. I think systems of power and hierarchies in general are they're not inherently good or bad. In general, it's a meritus. It's a
Meritocracy.
Meritocracy is a thing that's in there, but normally you get that. Like LeBron James has led the Los Angeles Lakers to the conference championship, and he's considered in the hierarchy and the system of power. He has a lot of power in the National Basketball Association. In the hierarchies, his team is ranked higher than other teams, and that's in there. And then maybe you can say the NBA is a society of sorts. But would you say that I wouldn't consider it bad or evil that LeBron James put in all that effort and work to be the best player, and he happens to have the genetics and the right type of situations to be just amazing. Like, I'm not going to be anywhere close to as good as LeBron. I just can't be. So if I enter the society of the NBA, he's going to be higher than me in the hierarchy and have a lot more power due to that. So I don't think this is inherently negative, but I think it seems to me that, as we'll talk about it when we start talking about the applications of this, why we're breaking this down to different sections, is people seem to think hierarchies and power, systems of power, are inherently negative.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you see that happening as well?
Yes, because something that often comes up when we talk about our ideal anarcho-capitalistic society, one of the things I always bring up is that there would still be hierarchies. I mean, you're still going to have big companies. You're still going to need people to run those. You're still going to have bosses you answer to. You can't escape this, no matter what the system is. And then, of course, if you go in the opposite direction, full totalitarianism, obviously it's even worse. Only it's people in government that you're answering to. But you know, this is the thing I never get about the syndicalists who basically say, oh, well, the workers should run everything together. It's people who say that, I'm convinced they've never been a manager, because you can't vote on every single decision. What would happen? Employees would say, hey, let's vote to come in later. Hey, let's vote to not get written up if we make mistakes. I mean, you can't run a business that way. It's impossible. And if there's a model for how to do it, I'm willing to see it. But just realistically, I don't see any way that could work.
Yeah, exactly. Those are some of the questions. Okay, now into the points here below. So there's a postmodern political principle. Now it's number 1, the blurring of boundaries. Number 2, the power of language. Number 3, cultural relativism. Number 4, the loss of the individual and the universal.
Correct.
I think that last one is one of the most nefarious parts of it.
Definitely.
Okay. The postmodern principles and themes in application. Despite mutating to become actionable for identity politics, applied postmodernism has retained the 2 postmodern principles at its core. The postmodern knowledge principle, radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism. What would you kind of just define the cultural constructivism as here?
So basically, when you want to talk about how knowledge is created, they would argue that it's created by the way the culture decides what is true. So, for example, to use the analogy I made last time, the sun is the center of the universe. We know that's objectively true, but the way we figure that out is we had to have a scientific method which developed following from Aristotle and later with Francis Bacon and so on. And the way that knowledge evolved in our culture over time gave us the means to figure that out. That's basically what they're saying. But that was created by certain people with certain value systems, and then they just took it further and applied it to other things, and that was our means for arriving at truth.
Okay. So they have some more explanation here. This denial of objective knowledge or truth and commitment to cultural constructivism and belief that whatever it is we call truth is nothing more than a construct of the culture calling it that has been largely retained, with one important proviso. It's a proviso or proviso? Proviso?
I think it's proviso.
Okay. Under applied postmodern thought, identity and oppression based on identity are treated as known features of objective reality. That is, the conception of society as comprised of systems of power and privilege that construct knowledge is assumed to be objectively true and intrinsically tied to social constructions of identity. I think this is a thing that lies back to people making certain statements and just saying they're just like, oh, it's just so clear. And I'm like, if it's so clear, can't you give me a simple definition of it? Or if there's so many examples, oh, there's so many reasons that is true. Can't you give me two or three? Like if there's just an infinite amount of reasons, then it should be easy to just pick out a few basic ones. But you often find like it's something that's taken for granted. It's like, no, in the beginning, God made this. So in the beginning, Adam and Eve, whenever you talk about anything in the Bible, if I go back to ask you, well, how did humans come to be? Like the Adam and the Eve thing is taken for granted. It's not something I think a Christian feels the need to come and describe. Like, why is God doing this? Because he made it all. That's already an established thing. So I think this is kind of a foundational part of the ideology, kind of something that's taken for granted.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if axiom is the right word, but it sort of applies that if we're looking at things through this lens, this is always going to be the case. The way James Lindsay put it in an interview I rewatched recently was that he was saying how the whole purpose of things like reason is that it's supposed to give us it's not the best comparison, but God's eye view of things. The idea is that reason is universal to everyone, so if everyone applies it, we can arrive at the same conclusions. Now, what it is they're saying, no, this isn't the case, that, no, we can't take that perspective, that we just see things through the lenses of identity, so there is no God's eye view, essentially. That's what they're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason part is a construct, but the oppression is a sort of a universal.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next part, the postmodern political principle, a belief that society is formed on systems of power and hierarchies, which decide what can be known and how. This has also been retained. In fact, this is central to the advocacy of identity politics, whose politically actionable imperative is to dismantle this system in the name of social justice. Mm-hmm. The four key themes of postmodern thought also survived the death of the high deconstructive phase and subsequent applied postmodern turn. So with this one, with the whole things are supposed to be there. So social justice, and this is the thing. Some people seem to say social justice is all these other things. When I talk about social justice, this is what I'm talking about. This is why I'm saying social justice is, when somebody says I'm a social justice warrior or we're fighting for social justice, it is key and tied into postmodernism. So if you want to say there's something you're doing that is not really tied into postmodernism or the things in here, then that's something else. That's advocacy. There's things that people have been advocating for things before the postmodern ideology came to be. And not every single advocacy for issues that are socially based is social justice. There's some things that are outside of this. Like I think social justice is talking about a specific thing, right?
Well, because I would also add that just the whole concept of justice, that justice historically in the West, in the classical liberal tradition, would be about justice for the individual. If a crime is committed against you, okay, we arrest that criminal, they go to jail or something. But this is about focusing on how certain groups face certain oppression or inadequacies, and that it's supposed to bring the whole group up. That's the idea.
Yeah, and one of the questions that might go over here in the next section of the blurring of boundaries, the blurring of boundaries, is how people talk about the justice. See, when someone's talking about justice, and I'm like, okay, the justice system. So if you say X group is oppressed, and I say if it's social justice, then we're dealing with the justice system. So where are the laws that are somehow oppressing these people? If it just comes down to just somebody's preference, what can I really do about somebody's preference? If there's a whole bunch of women who go out and they say, if every single white woman in the United States of America just said, I'm not going to marry any black men, and then I'm living in the United States of America and I just can't find a wife because all the non-white women are married or something. I can't say that it's a social justice issue that I need to make the government somehow incentivize white women to marry me. Like it's not something that I can do. That's not something that goes into the scale of justice. That's if they decide to do that personally in their own thought process, that is outside of, I think, the justice system, especially when you talk about social justice, when you talk about societies, that comes to individuals deciding to do things based off of their own thoughts. But as was mentioned above, they have there's an erosion of the individual in this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the blurring of boundaries. This theme is most evident in postcolonial and queer theories, which we shall discuss today, which are both explicitly centered on ideas of fluidity, ambiguity, indefinability, and hybridity. I've never heard that word, hybridity. That's a good word. All of which blur or even demolish the boundaries between categories. Their common concern with what they call disrupting binaries follows from Derrida's, is it Derrida or Derrida?
Derrida.
From Derrida's work on hierarchical nature and meaninglessness of linguistic constructions. This theme is less evident in critical race theory, which can be quite black and white, double meaning intended. Good one. But in practice, the intersexual feminist element of critical race theory encompasses many identity categories simultaneously and tries to be inclusive of different ways of knowing. This results in a messy mixing of the evidence with the evidence with the experiential, in which a personal interpretation of lived experience, often informed or misinformed by theory, is elevated to the status of evidence, usually of theory. I think that is a key one where they say my lived experience. They say, my lived experience is that this is racist. Then somebody says, oh, well, I've never been racist. Well, to hell with your lived experience of never actually seeing a racist person. I'm telling you, my lived experience means there actually is racism in reality. Yeah. So that's one of the things to me where I was like, come on now. Like, are you serious? Okay. Anything to add on that first section?
No, I mean, of course, as we get into each specific ideology, I'll be explaining how each one of these things applies, but I think most people who are somewhat familiar with these things have probably heard these talking points before.
Yeah, especially the different ways of knowing. That always makes me so cool when I hear that. That one, I heard that one a lot earlier before I even heard about the general concept of postmodernism. I think it came to in the past when people were still talking about, oh, men and women, who is more intelligent or whatnot. Then they're like, oh, there's different ways of knowing, like the EQ, the
emotional quotient.
Emotional quotient. What is the Q stand? Yeah, emotional quotient. Is that what it is?
That's right.
That has been going around. Did that come out of postmodernism, actually?
I would have to look. I mean, I was looking this up where standpoint epistemology or standpoint theory comes from. That's the belief that there's no universal way of knowing, that everyone just sees things through the lens of identity. Some people have said that this started back as far as Hegel with his whole master and slave dialectic. Then, of course, Marx had, well, it wasn't Marx, but it was one of his contemporaries. His name was Dietzken, who came up with the idea of bourgeoisie versus proletariat logic, the idea you just see things through the lens of your class. Then, of course, it got expanded to these other things later. So when this specifically began is kind of hard to say, but the general idea has been around for some time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is more like a river of thought, and then it's like this section of the river is called this, or it's the kind of thing where you see that, where it's like the Amazon has tributaries, where it's like, where does the Amazon start and where do the tributaries really end? Like, it's kind of a thing where you just define something at that point where it actually is like, okay, this is something different all of a sudden. All these things have come together to form this. But then the Amazon itself also is a tributary to other things, like some streams and rivulets come off from the Amazon later down as the Amazon flows. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So next part, the power of language. The power and danger of language are foregrounded in all of the newer applied postmodern theories. Discourse analysis plays a central role in all these fields. Scholars scrutinize language closely and interpret it as accordingly to theoretical frameworks. For example, many films are watched closely for problematic portrayals and then disparaged, even if their themes are broadly consistent with social justice. Additionally, the idea that words are powerful and dangerous has now become widespread and underlines much scholarship and activism around discursive or verbal violence, safe spaces, microaggressions, and trigger warnings.
Correct.
So with this one, they definitely, I think, I first heard this being put in a certain way by this guy Bill Whittle.
Yeah, I remember Bill Whittle.
Right. So he had something, he's talking about the glamour, how there's something to do with Hollywood where there's a glamour about it. We're glamorizing, but when you break down the etymology of the word glamorizing, it goes more into like magic, where it's like spells, where it's more of it's more just putting on some artificiality to express something and trick and define and display. So there is an aspect of that, and then you add that to the way things are portrayed, and then you add to the way people use words as kind of magic spells, where they want to just say, call you racist, and then it's just like, it's not necessarily the actual thing happening, but just thoughts and words are supposed to be enough.
Yeah.
Where silence is violence,
Yeah.
or certain words are enough to create somebody to trigger and crumble and have to hide away. Where there is that aspect it's creepy. It's a creepy kind of situation to live in. It's blasphemy. It's kind of that same kind of field that leads to blasphemy. Oh, you said that word. Don't say the devil's name. That brings the devil. Or oh, you can't use God's name in vain. You're going to offend him. You bring down his wrath on you. It's a weird kind of situation.
It is.
Okay, so the next one. This is talking about something films watch closely. There's currently right now as we're recording this. There's a situation where it seems like 95%, even more than 95%, of the people who have watched this particular film or seen anything about it are like, look, we know what this is about. Enough about this. And then there's a small cadre of people who are kind of defending it. You could look up that thing. I think you'll know what you're talking about. I don't want to like mention it and I just get some things knocked out. Okay, so number 3. Cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is, of course, most pronounced in postcolonial theory, but the widespread use of intersectionality in social justice scholarship and activism and the understanding of the West as the pinnacle of an oppressive power structure have made cultural relativism a norm in all applied postmodern theories. This applies both in terms of how knowledge is produced, recognized, and transmitted, one cultural artifact, and in terms of moral and ethical principles, another cultural artifact. Okay, so with this one, I've had this kind of question as well. When people talk about different cultures, black culture, this culture, that culture, one thing that comes up a lot here in Kenya is, or comes up sometimes, is someone will say, oh, Kenya is worse because of the colonial effect and things like this.
Yeah.
We need to go back to more African type of things or tribal or traditional things. And I'll hear this sometimes from somebody who is a Christian, and I'm like, well, are you going to also let go of Christians? Are you going to go back to worship the gods of old? Is that what you're going to go back to Atomism or something? Like, oh no, that part's okay. I'm like, well, also that part isn't necessarily Western. That was also something that was appropriated from the Middle Eastern people, the Semites at that time, and that was changed, and it was brought in. It was the Enlightenment, and they did this thing with the 66 different books. So where does it end? And if people say, oh, we need to stop using things, we need to see, oh, we'll show them. We need to have a day where people don't use anything invented by women. Or we need to have a day where you don't use anything invented by black people. Are you going to have a day where you just stop speaking English? Like, is that something that's going to happen?
You know who ContraPoints is?
Yes.
Yeah. So she did a video about the West, and I watched it out of curiosity. And it was interesting because in some ways I actually sort of agreed with some of her points. Like, for example, when she said, what is the West? Is that they talk about Judeo-Christian, but then it becomes, okay, how much of this did we inherit from Greece and Rome? How much of it can be attributed to Christianity? And then how much later on other things? So, obviously I disagree with her on a lot of things, but I thought that was a good point because people say the West like it's this one thing. And again, no, it borrows from all these different traditions, and you could even argue those traditions are at odds with each other. Judea versus Rome and all of that.
Yeah, like that, I have suspicions towards that term Judeo-Christian. Like, I mean, if you go to Judeo-Christian, you just go all the way and just say Abrahamic, and let's add the Islamic in there. You just go Judeo-Chrislamic or something. Yeah. Because why are you just cutting out the third brother? Like, oh, we're just gonna cut you out. No, bring that guy in there as well. if you're gonna add the older brother, add the younger brother in as well. But yeah, so there's certain issues with that where I'm like, okay, if you say we need to get away from Western things, oh, this is part of black culture. They say like hip hop is black culture. Well, I don't know any hip hop songs that are not in English, at least from the beginning. People say, look, it started in black environments. Well, all that stuff was in English.
Yeah.
English is not a quote unquote black language.
Yeah.
So is part of black culture actually British culture. Like so there's this part, like let it go. We appropriate things. That is why humanity has gotten to where we are. That's why all life is appropriation. We
Yeah.
appropriate calories from things, and hopefully you guys can be appropriating some information from us as we are appropriating this information that was put down by other people, and we can hopefully do better. So the last section before we get into the analysis and we close this part up. Number 4, the loss of the individual and the universal. The intense focus on identity categories and identity politics means that the individual and the universal are largely devalued. While mainstream liberalism focuses on achieving universal human rights and access to opportunities to allow each individual to fulfill her potential, applied postmodern scholarship and activism is deeply skeptical of these values and even openly hostile to them. Applied postmodern theory tends to regard mainstream liberalism as complacent, naive, and indifferent about the deeply ingrained prejudices, assumptions, and biases that limit and constrain people with marginalized identities. The individual in applied postmodernism is something like the sum total of the identity groups to which the person in question simultaneously belongs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why I was saying, to me, this is the most egregious part of postmodern theories and the different things that we're going to be discussing from them. And these are the things that I see within them. And if I was told to identify myself as something, the key thing would be I'm an individualist that just wants to get as much information about what actually is in life as possible.
Right.
That's pretty much the key reason I do most of the things that I do. And then there's other things just in basic biology. We're driven to, as a life form, to reproduce and to continue our life and all these things. Otherwise, I'd be committing suicide. But when it comes down to it, all the other things are kind of based off of the valuation of that individual and how can I be an individual, realizing I'm an individual part of something much greater of this universe. I'm an individual aspect, as individual as possible, an aspect of this universe that is also in turn made out of different things. Like just like a single blood cell from me is a single blood cell, but it's not me. Like that, you couldn't call that blood cell. Oh, you killed that. You destroyed that blood cell. You've killed Silas. No, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That's why, to me, when people look at these things and they say, "Oh, individuals are parts of groups," yes, I understand that. I am right now living in Kenya. I am right now part of a conversation with Stephen, but we're still an individual. I'm right now somebody who has published videos on whatever platform you're watching this. I'm one of that group, but I'm still an individual part of that group. And this is something that I don't, that really frustrates me when I see people rubbish the idea of individualism or be like, oh, somebody close to you had a conversation where they were talking about how there's something bad about America that has this rugged individualism. We're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? That is why America is great. That's part of what is very good about America from my perception. That's one of the things I value about it.
Well, the argument against this always too is people talk about we as a society, whatever. It's like, well, what is society? It's a collection of individuals. I mean, though it's made up of people, those people have their own goals, aims, preferences, all that. You can't just decide, okay, this is good for every one of those people. I mean, like that's a debate that's occurring with the lockdown right now because there are people who say, oh, I'm worried about exposing elderly relatives and all that. And of course, I get that. But then the other side of it is, well, if the risk is so much lower and businesses are closing, people's livelihoods are gone, okay, it's not good for everyone to stay locked down. And we have to decide, okay, let's weigh everyone's individual needs. Then there's going to be a risk either way, but we have to take it. It can't just be, okay, this is good for everyone, the end. Oh.
Yeah. And when you go into that point, this is something that I think we might have discussed before, but I'm still wondering with it is, there seems to be a thing where the intersectionality, where you keep breaking people down more and more and more, where I was thinking, oh, maybe they'll eventually break down all the way to the individual. Like they're like, as of this, under that, under this, under this, under that, under that, and that, until they get to the point where no two people in that group could possibly be as of the same things. But that thought quickly went away when I realized they're breaking themselves down to these groups. So it's like, as a gay person, and then when they say they're a gay person, they don't use their own individual ideas and lives to define what that is. Like, as an individual that is gay, it's as a gay person. So they have a category of gay people with all these definitions of things that they believe are constructed to define what a gay person is. So once they say as a gay person, they adopt all those things. It's not that they have those things and that's why they feel themselves to be part of a gay. They say once you are gay, you have to adopt these things. So it's more breaking yourself down to have as many categories of definitions that you can adopt instead of saying we're going to define from the personal points. And I think that's why they say, oh, you're this? How can you not believe this? I'm like, because I'm an individual. Why are you assuming that because I'm black, I'm going to vote this way? Why are you assuming because you're gay, you have to like these kind of things? Like those are the things that are so frustrating.
Sure. We'll get more into that in the section on intersectionality, but yeah, gets pretty crazy.
Okay. So I think right now we're going to wind this part down. This was just like the introductory part. I wanted to record this, but we wanted to discuss this part. So when we're continuing different sections of the series, when we mention postmodernism, instead of going through back and forth, because problems occur because of what X is, not because of what X is, because of how we define X. Right. So when we're talking about this, this is what we're talking about. Probably will also break this part out itself as an individual video where you can come back and people can just go, hey, this is what we're talking about postmodernism from this actual book and this kind of conversation series. And now we're going to go into the discussion of the section that he wanted to, the first section he wanted to discuss during this discussion time, which is postcolonial theory, right?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. So this is the first of the applied postmodernism fields. It started around the end of World War II when a lot of the Western powers were sort of grappling with their role in the world. I think a lot of people felt guilt about some of the oppression they had inflicted on populations they ruled. You know, this was exacerbated, of course, by World War II itself. And some of it, too, was just financial. I mean, Britain was basically bankrupt, so they couldn't afford to police all these areas, have a massive army and navy. So a combination of these factors caused them to decolonize, as it's called. Decolonization, of course, meant this in the literal sense. Okay, we're going to pull our troops out of these areas. They're going to become independent countries, self-ruled. Of course, this term later went on to apply to all sorts of things, culture, which we'll get into. It takes the postmodern principles of rejecting objective truth and the political system, the idea of, well, the way that we think we know things was set up by the imperial powers, and the political systems were also set up by the imperial powers, so they have to be deconstructed accordingly. And then I'd point out here, not all the post-colonial figures were were postmodernist, but the main ones are. This, of course, as I started to mention in the last bit, deals heavily with standpoint theory or standpoint epistemology. That is, that everything is just seen through the lens of identity. Of course, this obviously deals with it insofar as it applies to the imperial powers, but also the people being colonized. So, any thoughts or comments?
Yeah, there seems to be the added thing that I think we also did discuss in the first part of this conversation series was the aspect of the focus on the West, because they don't necessarily apply this to the imperialistic efforts and the colonial efforts of the Middle Eastern countries, of Asian countries. That doesn't really seem to fall into this kind of analysis when they talk about these topics. It is something that is quite focused on the Americas, the colonial activities that happen in the Americas, and in a lesser extent in Africa. They don't talk about
the Far East, which I'll get into in the discussion.
Okay, so with the Far East, yeah, I guess you'll get to the discussion. So yeah, that's interesting to see that one, because for me, I've seen it mostly focused on a few key issues in Africa. They don't talk about the different empires that existed within Africa that were conquering each other and things like that. They don't really talk about, do they? Maybe they do. Maybe they talk about the effect of the empires that existed within Europe, within Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that kept going back and forth and conquering each other. Maybe some of these theories, they've actually applied them to the effects that have happened and resulted into why the countries are the way they are now. I don't know, but it just seems to me to be a focus on the modern European powers as they exist, as they have existed over the last hundreds of years, maybe 300 years, going back to as you said, the colonial time with the New World and there's a long time between the discovery of the New World and Africa. So we're talking about the last great decolonization period which involved the establishment of most of 99% of the countries in the world as they are right now, the borders and things like that. Once people decided to go back home for the various reasons, as you mentioned, that's what it's focused on. And it seems to be only on the European powers and the United States of America, and doesn't really seem to touch what other countries did before, during, or in some cases after that period, right? Okay, but let's get into the rest. That's just my general thoughts from what you said.
Okay, so it starts with a man named France. They say Fanon. I'm thinking it's Fanon because he was born in Martinique, which was a French colony.
Okay.
He was a psychiatrist. He was born in 1925. He's not considered the start of post-colonial theory, but he produced works that were sort of proto-post-colonial theory, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book in 1952 called Black Skins, White Masks, which basically had to do with how racism and colonialism, of course, but it had to do with how the people colonized were sort of influenced and controlled by the people ruling them, so they would sort of adapt a lot of the colonial powers' styles and traditions as a way to sort of assimilate better with them, and then they lost their own tradition in the process. He went to Algeria during the War of Independence, and in 1959 he wrote a book called A Dying Colonialism, which talked about how French culture affected Algeria, and then how, when France left, the impact that had as far as if traditional culture started to come back and all that. I actually have a friend from Algeria. I may ask him about this. 1961, he wrote another book called The Wretched of the Earth, which talked about how colonialism was basically a denial of the humanity of colored peoples, and that it was designed to erase their identities, and that to preserve their mental health, they had to resist their occupiers, and then that would of course help them retain their identity and would be better for them. Now, I should point out here, he wasn't a postmodernist. He was a Marxist-Leninist. For those who don't know, that Leninist branch of Marxism, it dealt more with how if capitalism wasn't taking off on its own, there needed to be an intellectual vanguard that would impose it and sort of wake the masses up and bring them out of false consciousness, and then they would wake up and overthrow what was left of capitalism and install their system. That was a point of conflict with Mao, because Mao later on was more about appealing to the masses, whereas the Leninist approach was, no, we want an intellectual elite that's going to impose it from the top down.
Okay.
So,
and would this intellectual elite kind of, I mean, in theory, would the intellectual elite just dissolve after they've thrown down the system, or? Because we know in practice they end up putting themselves as pretty much monarchs, but that's...
Well, and that was the contention with Mao, because Mao is more about appealing to farmers and college students and all that, and he did recruit a lot of people. The Red Guard was basically made of college students, but he argued he was more in line with what Marx wanted, because it was more about appealing to people's irrationality and sort of getting them to overthrow the system, whereas Lenin and later Stalin was more about, no, we're going to impose the system on everyone, we decide everything. But of course, China obviously devolved into an authoritarian nightmare too, so they're both pretty bad. But that point is key, because coming from Marxism, he was a modernist, not a postmodernist, so he still believed in reason, science, all that. And then because he was a psychiatrist, the concept of the colonial mindset, that came from Frantz Fanon. Any thoughts or comments?
No, I'm just saying okay.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to go on to Edward Said. He was born in what was called Mandatory Palestine in 1935. His father was actually an American Army veteran. That's how he was able to gain American citizenship. He's the father of postcolonial theory. He was influenced by Fanon and also Foucault. He was very interested in the psychological effects of how a culture, a language, and a religion could be subordinated to another culture. In 1978, he wrote a book called Orientalism, which focused on it had to do with how the West viewed the Far East, and how basically how it ruled it, how it imposed its culture on that, and how that affected the people living there. So Orientalism was a school of thought, yes?
I would disagree.
Okay. So he writes in the introduction, my argument is that history is made by men and women, just as it can also be unmade and rewritten, always with various silences and elisions, always with shapes imposed and disfigurements tolerated, that, quote unquote, our East, quote unquote, our Orient becomes, quote unquote, ours to possess and direct. He goes on here to say, I have found it useful to employ Michel Foucault's notion of a discourse as described by him in the Archaeology of Knowledge and Discipline and Punish to identify Orientalism. My contention is that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormous systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage, even produce, the Orient politically, sociologically, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. So, using Foucault's discourse theory, he basically wanted to figure out how did the West rule the East, not just militarily, but also through its culture, through its language, through controlling what was true, what can be talked about, etc. So basically, his idea was he wanted to sort of correct this power imbalance, and this meant recovering lost voices and perspectives. You know, we've talked before about history. Oh, it's his story. Let's tell these other versions. He focused heavily on this. So this was sort of the turning point from classical postmodernism. Well, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but it was the turning point. And instead of just deconstructing everything, people were saying, okay, we need to actually reconstruct things. We can look at what the West imposed, break it all down, but we need to offer an alternative. And Said and company were kind of the start of this. So any thoughts or questions or anything?
Yeah, I guess that kind of discusses some of the things that I was mentioning, where it's like, oh, how does this culture have something that is English? So it's like, okay, we kind of, this was imposed on us, so we just had to default and somehow personalize this artifact of the great oppressor. And I guess also some of the effects of those countries, like they can say, oh, China is bad now because of the influence of the big bad Western colonials that they had on there. And of course, there's places like India, which that's discussed. I don't know how often they mention this effect on places like Japan, because I don't know if the United States ever actually occupied Japan per se. I think Japan was the one that was, I guess, like with the Genghis Khan time, but Japan, that's another rather unique kind of situation that they managed to have the empire that they had.
Well, sorry, regarding Genghis Khan, I don't know if you know, he sent a few fleets to invade, but they got destroyed in typhoons, so they never even invaded Japan.
Yeah, I think I watched an anime or something like that. So, but with Japan, Japan's kind of like the United Kingdom or the Britain of Asia. So it's like an island, just chilling on the outside there. They just end up running things in the interior somehow. So there is a bit of that going on there. So yeah, anything else for this?
Well, I don't know. I was just going to add a few points about Japan. Japan is kind of an interesting case because for a while it was isolationist because the idea was they knew that other countries were being taken over, and a lot of it was, of course, not direct conquest, but it was the Europeans working with local collaborators. So that's why they deliberately banned foreigners from their country because they saw it as that. Well, like for example, in India, that's what the British did. They made alliances with certain princes, then they fought against other princes, and then they turned on those princes who helped them and things like that. So my understanding is that the Japanese knew that, so that's why they shut out all foreign influence. But then Japan sort of stayed backwards in time because it wasn't trading with and engaging all these modern ideas. But then in the 1800s, I forget the exact year, but after the Civil War, that was when the American fleet showed up, and it was of course diplomatic. But then they started realizing, okay, the rest of the world's moving forward, we have to catch up, and that's when they started building railroads. If you saw The Last Samurai, they get into how they trained their army, all that, and they realized, like, okay, we have to catch up really quickly or we're going to get crushed the same way everyone else has. And Japan, it was really interesting because they went from a feudal country to modern in a very short time. And I even like the political cartoon about the Russo-Japanese War, and it shows this little guy who's Japan picking up a big guy Russian, kicking him. And the idea was that they became really powerful and modern in a very short time. But they're kind of an unusual case because on the one hand, what I respect about them is that on the one hand, they were able to retain a lot of their traditions. Like they still have their emperor, they still have samurai as a rank and all that. But at the same time, they realize, okay, we have to modernize or we're not going to make it in the world. So,
Yeah, and this is the practicalities that people go through. It's cost benefit analyses that everyone makes, and it's not just one race, one thing. It's not part of white culture to do cost benefit analyses. When people look at Britain, like you'd mentioned that before, like people think, oh, slavery built X, Y, Z. It's like, no, slavery was crippling. It was directly damaging to the actual slaves themselves and their physical bodies.
Yeah.
But to the social body, it was crippling to just the advances and things that could happen. And it's very expensive to actually run a society based on slaves. That Britain, in part, it wasn't just like, oh, we all of a sudden think these people are just equally human beings like us, so let's go save them. A few people did have it for moral reasons, but for most of the reasons, because it just wasn't profitable anymore. Like with Japan, also, they're not like, oh, all of a sudden we really dislike our Japanese culture. We're just going to now let the white gaijin in. It's like, no, the gaijin has a gun and we want that Gatling gun. So we're going to open up somehow so we can get that Gatling gun too, because we have issues within our country as well. And if somehow, some way, this one people somewhere else gets those Gatling guns, or not even them, just our neighbors, they're going to be able to come over here and do things of that. So there's cost benefit analyses that we make on different things for different things. But when they talk about the history here, it's his story thing. I get that in some sense, but that's why I'm talking about the difference between using a word this as a, we got to be specific with the word here. Like history describes things that happened in the past.
Yeah.
No matter what I say about the historical content of the gods of Olympus, the gods of Olympus are not a part of history. They're a fictional story made up about a potential thing that people might have thought at some time. But never did they actually exist. So if I re-envision, reimagine, if I tell you my story of the history, that might be something that you think is history, but if it didn't actually happen, it never actually is what I would consider to be history. I don't know about most of history. The little of history that I know, I am very skeptical about, and I think a majority of the little of history that I know is inaccurate, and not even intentionally inaccurate, just by the fact that we just didn't have the ability to actually write down some of these things. Like some of the questions we're asking you are like, did this happen before this? Did this happen after that? Some of the people you're talking about here, like these writers you're talking about here, like Edward Said, how many other people were thinking about these things, but they didn't have a Twitter, they didn't have a Facebook, they didn't have the ability to write down these ideas before Said did. But then Said happened to write it down and have it be remembered, have it be written down, and have it be passed down. So we look back and say, oh, he's the father of this. Not because he was the first person to ever think about this, but because he's the first person that we've been able to have a historical account to go back to and say it's come from this and this and that and that. So there's a difference, I think, with accounting history, tracking history, versus what history actually is. Like the actual thing of history is just something that happened in the past. That's a
But my argument would also, against some of the people who say things like that, would be, we're doing the best with the information we have. Now, if new information comes to light, yes, we'll change our views, but we're doing the best with what we have. Not liking the way certain things happen, that doesn't mean we can just make things up, like with 1619 Project, where, okay, we can just make things up to tell another story that we want to hear. No, it's, you have to give me information that something was suppressed or hidden, and if you can't come up with it, well, we don't have any proof then. It's just your assertion versus what's written down.
Yeah, and that's another big question mark with some of these places. Like with Africa, there were things that were going on with African tribes, but a lot of them didn't have a written form of cataloging what was going on for various reasons. So some of these times, the first time we actually have, even as flawed of a history as those histories are, the first time we have that is when the Europeans went there and they started actually keeping track of some of these things. Right. In many cases, right now, a lot of the new historical findings that you're finding are institutes in the Great Britain with some grants, and then they go to the Middle East and they're digging in the holes and they're finding all these things and they're trying to like translate this and this and that and that. Where it's not necessarily like the Zimbabwean government who's coming together and saying, let's go back and track our history of what was happening before the colonialists. It's normally like somebody comes from another country. So there is an aspect of that where it's part of the human story. And I want to get into more just getting into like, this is all our story in some way, some form.
Yeah.
But that is something that is frustrating to me, that there's certain assumptions made about the whole "we was Kangs" thing. It's like we was Kangs. It's like, no, you weren't. like, like, how do you know that? There's just certain assumptions that before before Columbus came to the New World or came to the Americas, they just assume how life was. It
Yeah.
was had to deal with some connection issues, so there's going to be some splicing.
So I just wanted to go through a few of the other thinkers here. I have Linda Hutcheon, who was a postcolonial feminist scholar born in Canada in 1947. Uh, she wanted to sort of combine the two fields. She said both have distinct political agendas and often a theory of agency that allow them to go beyond postmodern limits of deconstructing existing orthodoxies into realms of social and political action. So this sort of follows the point earlier about how what they call applied postmodernism was about achieving actual reconstruction rather than just criticizing things as they are. Uh, Now I have two other scholars here who are prominent. I'm probably butchering the names, but they're both from India. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak and Homi K. Baba. It's a woman and a man. Sorry, I'm sure somebody out there is going to criticize my pronunciation. So Spivak was born in India in 1942. Baba was in 1949. So I think that's interesting because India gained independence in 47. So it was like one was a few years before, one was a few years after. It was similar to Said. Their work is very similar to Said's, but there's more emphasis on deconstruction via language in the tradition of Derrida. Spivak wrote a book called "Can the Subaltern Speak" in 1988. That focuses on the role language plays in power structures. So subaltern in her term basically means colonized people that had subordinate status. She actually coined the term, you probably heard this, epistemic violence, which is meant to describe the injury done to marginalized people when their speech is controlled through dominant discourse. I'm sure you've heard this in discussions. This is epistemic violence for disagreeing, all that. Spivak focused on the binaries of power and how those went to maintaining stereotypes. She talked about something called essentialism, which was basically collectivizing stereotypes used by the people in power, and the idea is that, okay, we're degrading the people under us. She came up with a term called strategic essentialism, which is basically the other side of that. The idea is that the oppressed people unite based on common characteristics to overthrow their oppressors. So, for example, in Kenya, you would talk about different people belonging to different tribes, but then when it came to overthrowing colonialism, it's, okay, let's all unite together, identify as Kenyans, let's drive out the British, then we can sort out our own individual differences, tribal conflicts. Okay. Baba took a very similar approach, but focused more on the role language played in constructing knowledge. Both these thinkers are very difficult to read. Philosophy and literature even gave a bad writing contest, and Baba actually won the number two. He won the number 2 prize, only second to Judith Butler, who we'll bring up in another discussion. Baba wrote, "If for a while the ruse of desire is calculable for the uses of discipline, soon the repetition of guilt, justification, pseudoscientific theories, superstition, spurious authorities, and classifications can be seen as a desperate effort to quote-unquote normalize formally the disturbance of a discourse of splitting that violates the rational enlightened claims of its enunciatory modality."
Wow.
So in plain English, basically what he's saying is that the colonizers used stereotypes and stereotypical jokes to sort of degrade and then control the people. And his argument is that they were doing it to convince themselves that they were terrified of talking about ways that make sense. Now, again, this is going into mind reading and unfalsifiable claims, but that's what he was saying. And then what's interesting here is that Baba sort of turns against Foucault because he says something like, "Is the language of theory merely another power ploy of the culturally privileged Western elite to produce a discourse of the other that reinforces its own power-knowledge equation?" So he used Foucault and Derrida and then sort of turned against him, saying, well, these are white Western men. What do they know about us? So any thoughts or commentary?
Yeah. Well, at least, of course, the language thing. There's an interesting part about I don't know if it's interesting, but there's something I think that's worth observing is who are the loudest speakers on these things? Who originated some of these terms? They talk about, oh, this is for the people, this is for the downtrodden people. But you look at the language that's used, you look at the characters that are in there, and they're not necessarily the downtrodden of the
Yeah.
societies that they
Yeah,
live
exactly.
in. And why are they using certain language? I know people used to be more specific, and I don't know this because when I look at the history, when you hear about things from the Victorian times and things like that, most of the things you hear are the books written about the upper middle class, or they're written by people in literature who are
Yeah.
writing about other things, and they're writing it in the voice that they think these people speak in. You're not actually in the mill houses and in the
Yeah.
factories sitting with those people and going to those houses where the people used to live, like 50 people in a 5-bedroom home, like entire families living in one room, multiple families living in one room, and things like where somebody has to put a sheet up to have different separation, that kind of thing. The language and the voices and the things those people were using, the vocabulary was probably just as brutal, as guttural as anything you can hear in just the most like lowbrow, I guess you want to say lowbrow, like random chat room online where you're like, what are these people talking about?
Yeah.
I think that's the pros that you'd have. So when people were talking about this, was the average person of that time able to pick up this and make any more sense out of what they were saying than we are now? I think that's probably not the case, because sometimes I do that. I get to like semantics and I use certain words. I can go into slang. We could try to have this whole conversation in slang, and I just don't think it'll be as informative as using certain specific words. But
Yeah.
when I try to use a big word or a longer word, I'm trying to use it because I think it more accurately describes the thing that I'm talking about. I find that not to necessarily be the intent behind what some of these people are doing. And that's one of the memes where it's like, oh, just using random flowery language, putting these different terms together, where you just add that, and oh yeah, okay, it made some sense, like a DPT type of thing. One last thing with the two last Indian thinkers there, how critical were they about the caste system in India?
That's actually a good question. I didn't read as much on that. I mean, I looked them up on my own outside of the book, but I didn't see as much about that because if I remember correctly, I think they both taught in the U.S. They're older now, so I think their focus was more just colonialism. But then, of course, that gets into what are the issues in their own countries.
Yeah, were they even born there? Maybe they were born in the United States.
No, because I read that they were born in India, but I'm not. I have to look up when I would have to look up when they went to the U.S. and all this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think because the caste system, a lot of the people who complain about social justice issues seem to think the United States of America is actually what India is. Like they seem to be talking about things where there's actually examples in other countries where that is literally the thing that you're talking about America is figuratively. Like you look at the treatment of certain groups in China, and that is literally what they say the United States government is doing to Americans. I'm like, no, no, that's what the Chinese government is doing to Americans. You look at the caste system. The caste system is a different thing. You're born in a certain place, and you don't get out of that place.
No.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the colonialists actually disrupted the caste system. It existed before the colonialists, that one I
Yeah.
know.
It
And
goes
then
back.
after the colonialists left, it came back.
I,
Because
I'd
it's
have
still there now.
I'd have to look up the history of that, but I do know that it goes back to. I mean, Hinduism goes back to prehistoric times, they say. So, I mean, this goes back thousands of years at this rate. So it's been
And that
around.
is one of the
Like,
places where I think that's one of the places that does have the actual history, the actual written history, rather decently kept history for comparatively to what was going on at those times, where you can see, okay, this was how India was, then the British came in, then this happened, and then now this is what happened after. In
yeah,
Africa, that before this is what Africa was before the colonialists. That doesn't exist anywhere close to as much as it does in India, and I think there might be some comparisons to kind of tell from that. And there's less formal caste systems, of course. In Africa, there's nothing as tied in where it's like the faith and the nationalities, and the faith ties into like the actual aspect to reinforce that to even deeper points. Now I don't know how big they go with the tribes in India, But here in Kenya, there's actually already, it's an informal sort of thing. I don't know if this is tied into the physical sizes of people or where they're from. There's biological aspects to it, but there's certain fields of work where it's like, okay, security guards are usually this tribe. Like you look at the people who are like who help, like house help and people like that, maids and cooks and things like this. They tend to be majority from one tribe. You look at drivers; they tend to be majority from one tribe. You look at people who have like who work in restaurants. There's an odd thing that's kind of occurred with that. Now it's not necessarily like, oh, you have to be this in order to get this job, but there just has been something where it's like, oh, if you want this, chances are if you get somebody from this, it's better. Now that could be in part due to a referral for different reasons. Certain people might have entered certain fields, and in Kenya, you're still working a lot on referrals. Oh, you want a plumber? You don't necessarily just go to the Yellow Pages equivalent or type online and find a website for a plumber. It's like you know somebody who has a plumber, then they call that plumber over. And then if that plumber comes over and you need an electrician, that person calls his electrician friend, and then that electrician comes and becomes your electrician. And chances are those people are also living in communities that are tribally segregated. So, and that one goes further because some of those people would only know Swahili and the lingua franca of their tribe. So they have these other limitations. So there's different things that are interesting to kind of think about. Where I look at these things, and I think that is why they're very Western focused, because once you start applying these to other countries, a lot of these things just break down even more than the flimsy edifice that they'd set up to analyze the Western world with.
Sure. Yeah,
So,
that's good. Good ideas.
uh,
So, now people would say that, just to sort of continue with the discussion, some people would say that this whole thing emerged as a reaction to the oppression the people went through under colonization. And to be fair, there are points to that, and they quote some things. For example, things that Rudyard Kipling said. There is, I forget the author's name, but there was the book The Heart of Darkness, written about Africa, I think in 1899 or something like that.
Conrad something.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up. But like, so there definitely was a very racist attitude towards the people. But then the other argument against this would be, by the time World War II was ending and afterwards, people were becoming increasingly tolerant, and the West was becoming more and more pro decolonization. Like, let's let these people have their own countries. Again, as I mentioned before, part of it was also financial issues. Okay, Britain's basically broke from the war, so they can't afford to police all these countries and everything. But I think the attitudes were genuinely improving. And I was thinking to myself how they were saying how the authors attribute liberalism itself to being the cause of this change, because the idea is, well, if there's a universal humanity, equality under law, all those things, by definition, that means we have to be tolerant of other people and other cultures. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that we're going to have the same traditions, same value systems, but as far as equality under the law, as far as rights, all that. And postmodernism itself, I mean, it wasn't even heavily talked about till the late 60s, so it's almost like postmodernism was trying to take credit for things that liberalism was doing. And I thought this was sort of analogous to a lot of government policies where you see a certain trend, things are improving, and then a government policy gets implemented and they try to take credit for it. So, like, for example, they talk about, I think it was John Stossel talked about with OSHA, how workplace accidents were declining in decades prior, and then they put OSHA and they said, oh, look, OSHA did this, but reality is workplace accidents were declining for other reasons. Similar thing with the environmental ideas. I mean, a lot of people were switching to cleaner coal, filters on smokestacks, all that. So even before the EPA was founded, those things were going down anyway. And then, of course, the war on poverty. As we know, poverty was declining faster than it stagnated. And then on top of it, you're spending ultimately trillions of dollars. So
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of that, where they step in after the fact and say, oh, look, we did this, when in reality things were improving without them.
Yeah. And okay, but why do you think it seems now? This is something that there'd be ways to probably test this and get actual figures between this. But why does it seem that the state can readily assume and incorporate the ideas of postmodernism? Is it because they're inherently both? I was wondering if they're both inherently collectivist. Race that they just switched from being more, I think, in general, ideology-wise, pro-Christianity, to now massive aspects of it just seeming to adopt that postmodernist sort of ideology and concepts and language and lenses of way of packaging and discussing things. And this is not just the political left. Like, this is happening across the board. You're seeing this in people's interactions with society in general. It's becoming the language people discuss social issues with. And before you answer that, it was Joseph Conrad. It's a great book. Everybody should read that. Yeah. Okay, but yeah, so why do you think the government or social interaction seems to be readily adopting this? And it might not also be readily, because we've talked about this is stuff that started some time back, and we talked about how some of the things like the EQ thing that was coming from somebody else, somewhere else, like things like Gamergate and things were happening in atheism plus coming in and saying, we're not just about atheism, we're supposed to be about atheism plus feminism.
Yeah.
MGTOW, where people are talking about, the courts are going crazy. If you marry a woman, they live with them for a certain amount of time, you have to give them all these things, and they take your kids and all these things. So there were these different aspects coming in. So maybe that was coalescing over some time. But right now, it just seems that postmodernist people talk about we are persecuted, but I'm like, look, the governments are making programs for you. The big companies and corporations are virtue signaling to you. What do you mean you're oppressed? Why do you think that exists?
I think it depends. I think it depends on who's doing it. Like you just mentioned with the big companies and things, I think it's more they're sort of in that spot where they don't want lawsuits or to be accused of things. So it's, oh, look, we agree with this. But then if you talk to people behind closed doors, will they say the same thing? I don't know.
Okay.
I think for some people, of course, it's a grab for power and wealth that, okay, these things have happened to us, give us this money, give us this special treatment. And I think for other people, it's just sort of, it goes back to the point I mentioned in the previous discussion about Nietzsche and about certain ideology fills the void in people's lives. Like, I think there was that clip of Anita Sarkeesian that went around where she was talking about when she first learned this stuff, and then she goes, everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic. Yeah, I think for some people, I remember somebody was saying to me a while back how an ideologue is someone who latches onto a specific idea, just runs with it and applies it to everything. And I think that's what happens to some of these people. It's the fervor of the converted effect, where they just become fascinated by a particular subject or theme, and then they obsess over it and they apply it to everything in life. Like, I was thinking to myself, this reminds me in certain kitchens when a person learns about a certain ingredient for the first time and then they start putting it in everything. It almost reminds me of that. Like, they become fascinated with, wow, I didn't know this worked in this way, and then they just start applying it to everything. And then at some point, depending on the person, they usually calm down and realize, like, okay, wait a minute, let's take a bigger picture view. Maybe this ingredient is good in some things, but it's not in everything. Like, that's been one of my complaints about people who overuse truffle and truffle oil, is that at one place I worked, they kept putting truffle oil and stuff, and it's like, you might as well just have a bottle of truffle oil at your table. What's the point?
Yeah.
So I think, again, it depends on the person, but I think those are at least some of the reasons. I mean, if anyone has any others, feel free to interject. But
yeah. That is a good point. That is a good point, because with that Nietzsche Sarkeesian thing, I remember seeing that and hearing that. I'm like, are you kidding? Because that was before I'd actually heard of the postmodern theory and the stuff that's actually taught. That was before I realized how pernicious and how much it had actually entered academia, where this was the things that she actually had taken courses on that material content. She's actually memorized some of that stuff and believes it as much as anybody who believes the English alphabet would believe that as core material to go teach non-English speakers English. That's how she's approaching it. She's like, this is the alphabet of the way the world works. Yeah. Everything is racist. Everything is sexist. What was the last one?
Everything is homophobic.
Yeah, I mean, that is the stuff that was in there. So once I see it being written, like here in the initial explanation that we're talking about, where it's like, yes, that oppression is the base foundation thing that you have to assume is the only objective truth.
Yeah.
That does kind of make more sense of why, and that's why I'm saying I'm an individual who just wants to understand things. When I see Anita Sarkeesian saying that, I'm just like, how can you say that? Like, do you not look at the world and like, oh, okay, if she's taught this stuff, if she's viewing through this lens, then it makes complete sense she would say that. She's not just an evil person walking around trying to destroy all men.
Yeah.
That might be something that results from her being taught that, but she is doing what she thinks is positive for the world. whether
Yes.
it's actually positive or not in objective senses. We can find the actual ways to define that in different ways and say this is more positive towards this kind of objective. We'd have to agree on the actual objectives if there are things that we want to achieve. So there is that. But yeah, that's why I'm glad we can have this conversation. Glad this content is there. It brings more understanding. It might not be able to make me prevent Anita Sarkeesian from saying what she's saying, but it at least makes me understand why she would say what she'd say.
Yes.
So I think that's my thoughts on that second. So we can move on to the next one.
So just so basically decolonization. Originally, it was meant obviously literally as far as countries leaving the colonies, but then they started applying it to everything. I don't know if you remember in 2015 there was something in the UK called "Why Is My Curriculum White?" where they were complaining, of course, about the predominance of there was Rhodes Must Fall when they talked about tearing Cecil Rhodes' statue down. I'd imagine a lot of people watching know who he was. He worked for the De Beers Diamond Cartel. He actually helped inspire apartheid in South Africa, and he also set up the country of Rhodesia. It's named after him. And he also set up the Rhodes Scholarship. Now, obviously not a great guy. I mean, an imperialist, racist, stole a lot of their mineral wealth. But at the same time, he did play an integral role in the history of both Britain as well as these countries. And the Rhodes Scholarship is still around.
Yeah.
So, should his statue be torn down? No, I don't think so. I mean, should we teach who he is, what he did wrong? Sure. But tear everything down? No, it's the same discussion we're having now about in this country. Sorry, you had something?
Yeah, like how much of this can we do? Because eventually, like we can put in a thing together where we just go through and start looking at people like, let's try to find out if we can get some dirt in like Alfred Nobel, and then be like, oh, Barack Obama has to return his Nobel Peace Prize because Alfred Nobel said this thing about black people back in 19 like whatever. Like you could keep doing this, and I think this is just a little spoiler. I think I'll start doing more of that. Some of my most popular videos on my channel are where I play a character and I go, there was one that was like, Black Panther is not for white people. Then I said, like, there's a different video I was doing an African voice, and I was like, okay, Black Panther itself is actually not even for black people in the United States of America. It should be only for Africans. So there's these things you can kind of go with. I did one about feminists where I was like, oh, like reading something about pretending to be I don't know what the term was. It's something black feminist, not black as in the race feminist, but some hardcore type of group aspect of feminism. So I think I'll start doing that. I'll start going in and trying to find people and trying to see if I can get people canceled on the rules that they've used to cancel certain people, but try to focus on people that are generally liked or not really that controversial, just random people. Let's try to cancel people. Fall cancellations, yeah.
Well, you know this story about why Alfred Nobel came up with the Nobel Peace Prize. That whole story.
Didn't he invent dynamite too?
Yeah, and he hated the fact that he knew he created another weapon for people to kill each other with. So he thought, okay, why don't I do something peace oriented? So he came up with this prize.
Yeah. So it's and that's the thing. It's like, are we going to cancel like Albert Einstein because he was a key part of inventing the nuclear bomb?
Yeah.
Like, should we cancel him because of that? But he's also the key part to nuclear energy, and nuclear energy has done so much more. Even TNT itself, sure, it's killed a lot of people, but it's helped us being able to go in and build a lot of things that have helped communication, helped travel, helped get access to certain minerals and resources. It's our story. Like, you can't just damn one person and think you're going to be free from that damnation you sent out. That curse. We're talking about using words and magic. You send that curse out there, it's going to keep bouncing around and come back and hit you too. But yeah, okay, yeah. So you were mentioning the different people. You mentioned who are we? No, Rhodes. We're talking about Rhodes.
Yeah. So there was a book written in let's see here. There's a book written called Decolonizing the University that was written in 2018. The authors are probably butchering the names again. It was Gurminder K. Bambra, Dalia Gabriel, and Karim. There were some accents. Nisan. I don't know. I'm not sure. It looked almost Hungarian or something. So basically, they wanted to summarize a lot of this ideology and some of the thinkers. So Gabriel writes, The public sense of what history is remains influenced by positivist tendencies, whereby the role of historians is simply to, quote unquote, reveal facts about past that are worth revealing in a process removed from power. The epistemological insistence on history as a positivist endeavor functions as a useful tool of coloniality in the institution, as it effaces power relations that underpin what the quote unquote production of history has thus far looked like. So basically, history is written by the victor's argument, which is true. But then our authors go on to explain how this is the reason so-called revisionist history exists. I mean, that's kind of a pejorative now, but the idea is you go back and look for things that may not have been found. So, for example, some of the women's study scholars, they actually went back and they examined the role women played in, as far as in businesses and financial transactions. They found certain women's signatures on things. Karen Strawn mentioned in one of her discussions how at one point in London there were a lot of female master blacksmiths. So the point of this is to sort of say, now Strawn is approaching it from the angle of, if you're going to say women were excluded from these professions, she's saying, well, no, empirically that's not true, that you can look up in the London Register, and I forget the year, but it was 1800 and something, there were female master blacksmiths, meaning to reach that level, the profession had to be open to women. So
Yeah.
So in that certain sense, you know, there is a degree of truth, like you say, like we discussed earlier, that certain things have been kept secret, certain people have been erased, we'll never know. But at the same time, that's the point of going back and re-examining, is there something else? And the whole purpose, a good historian is supposed to examine those prejudices and biases and see, okay, is there anything that goes against them? Now, it doesn't mean they do a perfect job. Obviously, a lot has been lost, but you try to do the best you can with the data available. So I would say. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah. I mean, with some of these things looking back, and it was going back to the cost-benefit analysis, where I'm sure there was a chance. It's not like it was closed off where men couldn't be midwives or couldn't help with like giving like at-home births, but it happened to be a field that was probably 99.999% women. Now, does that mean men are worse than women? It's like, no. Something in society, the way it was at that time, just selected for women to do that job a lot more than men doing that job. Just the cost-benefit analysis of a man choosing to do that,
yeah,
just played for that. So I don't. This is the part that's frustrating, where people don't apply it to those. They just focus on one aspect of it, and then they don't apply it. Maybe that's why they need to dissolve the universal. Nothing can universally be applied. We only apply this selectively to the aspects that actually confirm our initial hypothesis of everything is sexist, everything is racist, and everything is homophobic, I guess.
Well, and that's sort of been that'll be my contention. And of course, as this conversation goes on, I'm going to bring it up probably several times. Is that this stuff isn't scientific, because what you're doing is they're starting with the conclusion that they want, and then they look for evidence that confirms it. When they can't find that evidence, they either get creative in making it up, or they redefine how we arrive at that evidence. So one of the examples I like, we'll do the critical race theory section next, but they make the example of, if you go into a store, let's say you have like a tailor shop or something where you have to approach a person directly, a white guy and a black guy. If you approach the white guy first, they say, well, you're racist because you're favoring the white guy and you're treating the black guy as a second-class citizen. But then if you approach the black guy first, they say, well, you thought he was up to something, you thought he looked suspicious or something, so you're showing your own racism by doing that. But what it is they start with that conclusion, then they just explain it away either way as to fit that conclusion, instead of, let's start with a hypothesis, does the evidence confirm or disconfirm that, yes or no? It's no, we start with the conclusion we want and then just find a way to justify it.
And it's a tough thing. And I think once people start realizing this, they can look and understand why some people behave in certain ways. That's why that one individual that was caught, who's been at some of these Antifa protests, was caught with a flamethrower, because he's living in a world where he thinks there is some existential evil that's constantly out there to get him. Now, I don't think nature cares one way or the other. Nature just keeps on trucking, keeps on going. It doesn't look out for us. There's no like positive karma for us, but there's also no negative like karma for us, and there's no devil either. You know, people say, "Oh, how do you live without believing in God?" Well, I also don't believe there's a devil out there that's constantly behind everything, trying to make every single person like ruin me or take me away from God's true path. And you see a similar kind of mentality from those. There's people who are truly focused on that. It's Earth. The Earth is a place where God sent the devil to terrorize us. So constantly, everyone we're dealing with, we got to see the devil's in the details. Like he's hiding in there somewhere. We got to find him. So they look at that and they say, okay, where is the devil in this? So I think that everyone is sexist, everyone is racist, everything is homophobic. That is the devil that they try to find in every single interaction. And I think once you start realizing that, at least once I started approaching these things in that sense, it started making more sense. And because these things that are outright irrational that I have to deal with, if there's some irrational Eskimo somewhere in Antarctica and he's making a YouTube video, I don't really care. I'll watch him, maybe like, okay. But then, as I mentioned, these people are going in and having effects on governments that are going to have effects on things in me. Yeah. If I have kids in the future, my kids are going to be around these people's kids.
Yeah.
You know, if I want to buy the PlayStation 5 and buy some cool new games, their ideas and things like that will involve in the actual game creation in a way.
Yeah.
So it behooves me to understand and be more aware of the things I'm going to have to deal with, come into contact with. And that's just part of what this process, I think, is. You don't have to agree with the stuff, but I think understanding is a positive thing.
And that's the thing. As a manager, I mean, I may interview and hire people that studied all this in school, and then that's gonna impact my dealing with them dealing with customers, all that.
Yeah.
So there was an essay in Decolonizing the University called Decolonizing Philosophy. It says here, it will be difficult to contest the idea that, generally speaking, philosophy as a field or discipline in modern Western universities remains a bastion of Eurocentrism, whiteness in general, and white heteronormative male structural privilege and superiority in particular. So that's, it's pretty typical, typical what we hear today. Decolonizing philosophy goes on to say, any serious effort to decolonize philosophy cannot be satisfied with simply adding new areas to an existing arrangement of power knowledge, that's Foucault's term, leaving the Eurocentric norms that define the field as a whole in place, or reproducing such norms themselves. For example, when engaging in non-European philosophies, it is important to avoid reproducing problematic conceptions of time, space, and subjectivity that are embedded in the Eurocentric definitions of European philosophy and its many avatars. So even the criticisms of time, even time and space is a problem, apparently.
I mean, they're talking about that. They're talking about Eurocentric nature. But then, as we've mentioned, this ideology itself is Eurocentric.
Yeah.
Would they make attempts to decolonize a Eurocentric view out of their own ideology as well, their own philosophy? And then when they talk about decolonized philosophy, is that because they admit that philosophy as a thing existed before colonizations, or because there's no country of philosophy, but there's a field of philosophy. So how could colonization exist in a theoretical field? Like, you have to. The term colonization is like setting up a colony. Like, so what is a theoretical colony? Putting in Western ideas in the field of philosophy. But then, when do they think philosophy started? I know, like, people like Confucius were talking about stuff on their own separate points. But they're talking about like this philosophy everywhere, even though it wasn't actually termed under philosophy before, like the Platos and the things like that.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
I'm trying to be as charitable as I can.
It's like, what is going on? It's like,
Well, you've heard the concept, right, of colored people's time? That whole.
Was that the thing with the Michigan people who were like, this is POC time and BIPO?
Yeah, it comes from that. Yeah. So it had it. Yeah. So, well, it was interesting because James Lindsay was saying in an interview, I think it was with Glenn Beck, how years ago he actually met a systems expert, and they were talking about this whole concept about, I'm operating on colored people's time, all that. But what he was saying is that how important time as an objective measurement is, what the systems expert did was he took a business and he did this, I think, as a computer simulation. It wasn't in real life, but what he did was he set all the clocks. He sort of desynchronized all the clocks. So this clock was a few minutes late. This was a few minutes early. This had the right time, and so on. And apparently, he said it took a very short time for the organization's productivity to drop to zero. Because if you think about it, like this person doesn't get done on time. This isn't ready for the meeting can't happen. This deadline's not met. And it just reverberates throughout the whole thing. So, and on a lesser scale, having worked in restaurants, I see sort of a similar thing. Okay, this person's station isn't set up on time. Other people have to help them. The kitchen's not open for service. You have someone who's there early. They complain. So all these things affect each other. But his underlying point was how if you're going to have this ridiculous subjectivist concept of time, how can that function? You can't. It's, you know,
Yeah.
it's just, I don't know. It's so nonsensical. I don't see anything else.
That's the thing. Time itself is not a social construct.
Yeah.
Like, but the 365 days of a year is a social construct. There is a Gregorian calendar or whatnot.
Yeah.
So that one I do understand. But there is, just because it's a social construct doesn't mean we need to rubbish it. That's a very, I think using time is something that I'll start doing more when I'm trying to tell people about the importance of defining things.
Yeah.
Right now it's 11:25, where because of but we are still existing at the same time in actual reality, actual existence. Yeah. But due to different conventions, different very real conventions of just the planet itself, us having the distance between us having a certain circadian like rhythms that are tied in to sunlight and the benefit that we have as a living organism to be awake and we're not nocturnal. So there's all these things tying in with that make some sense for us to currently say that for me here, it's now 12, it's now 11:26, but for you, it's what, 7 hour difference?
It's
so for you, it's about 4:26?
Yeah, 4:26.
Yeah. So that difference, we still exist at the same time. Yeah. But if I just start walking around here telling everybody, because I'm talking to Stephen and my friend Stephen, in his lived experience, it's 4. So I'm going to say everybody else here, it's 4 o'clock. Get out in the day, like open up your own store. That's not how things work. We have to agree that like in Kenya right now, we're agreeing on this time. I know there are things that are changing already with this. I think it's in, where was it? I don't know if it was in Asia. I was listening to some Jack Reacher book, I think, some Lee Child book, and he was in a location where they had adopted this new system where they have different times where they I think it was in Switzerland or something. It was in some location. I think it was in Europe, somewhere in Europe. I forget it. What was this? Was it in Europe or was it? It's really bugging me, right? It's in Germany. It was in Germany. This was a book. It was the second to last Jack Reacher book that was released, but it was going back in this past. And this is the time like right after the wall had come down, and Germany has some very progressive in the non-social justice term of progressive, like the actual progressive policies and things like that, where they were trying new things, and they've done that new thing where they just split out the days. So it's now the full-on 24-hour economy where there's some businesses that were traditionally done from 9 to 5 that are now actually 9 to 5, like 9 p.m. to 5 in the morning, where I think 25% of the jobs that were normally on that daytime calendar, people just decided to just switch. And I think that's something that's now we're getting in a time where I think we'll start seeing a change of what times are. I think we'll keep the time difference, but I think most places in the world that have the 2-hour, the daylight savings times, because of advances in technology and use of electricity, daylight saving times doesn't really make sense anymore. We're not an agriculturally centralized and like community anymore. We have the ability to have light whenever we want. So there's really no general benefit to be like, oh, we need to adjust the hours. So that's going to change already, I think. And I think we also are adjusting to a time as we drop out from this going to the office to work during the daytime type of things. We have this more working remotely. And I think this is going to be better for humanity, where it's going to be like people are literally going to be working, you pick your hours. Where it's like, in a week, you need to achieve these things. I don't care if you're doing it from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. If you want to do it for 72 hours in a row directly and then have the rest of the week off, do that. The key thing is to get the job done. That's why we had the definitions of time as we do. So I think that's a key thing.
It's funny you should mention that, because when my dad worked at IBM, that's actually what he did. He didn't work remotely, but it was basically you have to work 8 hours a day. It doesn't matter when, as long as you do 8 hours. So he
Yeah.
said there were people who would sleep in, come in at noon, leave at 8 at night. There were people who would work 7 to 3. A lot of people, of
Excellent.
course, did 9 to 5. But it was convenient for him because if he had something in that late afternoon or early evening, he could wake up early, go to work, do his job, and then go to that thing. Or and then okay, if he wanted to sleep in, okay, do that too. So as long as you were there 8 hours, and I guess you did what had to be done. I don't know exactly the details, but that was the general idea.
Yeah, and that's the thing. This formalization of everything and putting things and, oh, we have to do things in this way. It's not necessarily that positive thing. If everything was good for the goose, was good for the gander, we'd all be geese,
Yeah.
and we're not. It comes to the whole like the individual preferences and things like that. And I think that to me that is one of the exciting things that's coming out of this pandemic is it's shut down certain things that I think were mutated and just working on momentum,
Yeah.
and it's going to give people the chance to rethink certain things and start new things that I think would have taken decades more before there was the right kind of social situation for those things to even be entertained. So to
Right.
me, that's one thing that I think is a positive that's going to come out of this. Just so that report with like 60% of the jobs of the businesses that were listed with Yelp. So 60% of the businesses listed with Yelp has shut down, but the needs are not going to go away. So once things reopen and once the mandates stop, there might be new sorts of businesses that come up to supply those needs in possibly better ways. And that was just some of these thoughts that I've been having in this ongoing things with interactions. But once that starts, I think we're going to see an explosion of some really interesting things. Okay, so that's my post pandemic theory. Let's get back to the post colonial theory.
Sure. So decolonizing philosophy continues. Philosophy seems to have a special place among the discourses in the liberal arts because it focuses on the roots of the university at large, reason. This includes providing criteria for identifying and demarcating the humanities, the natural sciences, the social sciences, as well as for distinguishing reason from faith, secularism from religion, and the quote unquote primitive, and the ancient from the modern. These are central columns in the edifice that sustains modern Western rationality and the modern Western university. The modern Western research university and liberal arts, therefore, owe much of their basic conceptual infrastructure to philosophical formulations of rationality, universalism, subjectivity, the relationship between subject and object, truth and method, all of which become relevant targets of critical analysis in the decolonial term. So they're criticizing reason itself as being this is what decides everything in the Western canon. We have to re-examine all of this.
That's that's a tough thing.
Yeah.
Like they're criticizing reason itself. It's not because it's not that's unfortunate. That's why it comes from saying nothing is objective besides everything is oppression. Once you take that away, you can't understand that reason is reason. Things are reasonable whether you personally decide to be unreasonable or
Yeah.
not. It's reasonable. Reason is a thing that exists, and then you can either be going along with it or you can be going away from it. But you can't change something that is reasonable to not be. I don't know how to rightly put that. If
Well,
something is reasonable, you can't make it unreasonable. Like it's reasonable inherently.
well, I would make this point too. Is I mean, all the people who saying this, they use reason in their own lives. I mean, whoever you are, you're going to look both ways. You're going to look both ways before crossing the street. You're going to think about how you spend your money. You're going to think about where you apply to work. You're going to decide what is the criteria for buying a car. Now, those preferences may differ, but you're using objective principles based on your value system to decide. So, on the one hand, you're attacking reason, but you're using it in your own life.
Yeah, and even if they say, like, for example, they that example you gave with the people walking into a store,
Yeah.
they look at
Yeah.
the two different things, and then they try to find reasons for why that is reasonably
Yeah.
a expression of what they believe is the only truth,
Yeah.
rather than just looking at the reasons the individual people did the things. those individuals are not something they take into account. An individual person does not exist. So an individual person cannot have reasons. So they can't look and say like that person's reasons for doing that were things that I am not aware of. I need to actually interrogate them and try to find it out. But they're like, no, since this is what everyone's reasons are based on, I have to try to identify the reasons based on this that show this. And yeah, it's not a good place to be. It's not. Like when I see this stuff, it makes sense why so many people who are very loud and open about this don't really seem to be that happy in an objective sense, and just a general sense. Like they might try to signal a certain happiness, but you look at those people protesting, you look at some of these people that are being attracted by this, and it is starting to kite in a certain mentality, a certain kind of person, and it's not a pretty place to be. Yeah.
So next up here, we come up with the concept of research justice. You've probably heard this before. Basically, the idea that science, reason, empiricism, objectivity, universality, and subjectivity are overvalued. We need to give credit to emotion, experience, traditional narratives and customs, and spiritual beliefs. I think enough people have probably heard that. Invalidating emotion is something that comes up a lot. I've gotten that criticism hurled at me as well. So the idea is that research justice is supposed to give equal validity to all these voices.
Okay. Now again, that's another thing with the justice. There's the justice system, which is separate from this term justice that they use here clearly. Because what is research justice? Like, so there's those systems set up. And then that's why I think once you think of a justice, a criminal justice system, there's other systems of justice. There's different justice systems, and I think that's why you try to see some of these people make attempts to enter the regulatory bodies of all these. And this might be where the government type of thing comes. Because if you're concentrated on justice, you're going to want to be part of the controlling bodies that lay out that justice. So if there is a controlling body that is interested in, like the government themselves, it already attracts a type of person who likes being able to make laws and rules for other people. So if there's an ideology that all of a sudden comes by and says like, yes, this is all about rules, and then they're going to want to see how they can use that to their benefit and use that new tool. So maybe that's just kind of what it is. They're already in the field, like, oh, this is a new kind of ball we can use. Yeah, I'll use this ball to score the same goals that I want to score here. So I think that might be. I think it's like you're a golf player. You like playing golf. Then you get this brand new golf club with this new kind of metal called social justice. You're like, yeah, let's use this instead. Let's put that in my what's it, the golf bag? Is that what they call it? Things? What do they call this?
Golf bag.
It's not a golf bag.
Yeah.
What is it? I'm
gonna look it up. I feel like I learned it at one point, but I don't use the term regularly, so I forget.
Okay, yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I'm going to look this up.
All right, so in the 2015 book called Research Justice, Methodologies for Social Change, Andrew Jolivet, who's a professor and former department chair of American Indian Studies at San Francisco University, says, research justice is a strategic framework and methodological intervention that aims to transform inequalities in research. It is built around a vision of equal political power and legitimacy for different forms of knowledge, including the cultural, spiritual, and experiential, with the goal of greater equality in public policies and laws that rely on data and research to produce social change. So I think you pretty much get the idea. The idea is we have to give validity to all forms of knowing, all forms of research, so everyone feels represented.
Okay. Okay, I looked. It is golf bag. I thought there was a different name for that thing, though.
Yeah, I did too. Like caddy bag.
But maybe this is going against with what I was thinking about this. Where I'm thinking about the golf bag, and I thought there was something else that there was a bag for it, but no, it's actually golf bag, and maybe So here it's again just about definitions. Problems occur because of how we define X, not what X is. So I was thinking just with golf bag, I thought was more complicated than golf bag. There might be certain things about history that people think are more complicated or different than what they actually were, leading to confusions. Colonization, kind of this whole I think that's why the we was Kangs thing happened, where people say if the white people hadn't colonized Africa, we'd still be king. We'd be kings now. I think that's the thing. They're saying that's if you decolonize the history, the historical trajectory of the Africans, it would have gone to kings. But them coming in now resulted in King James or King James with XING, like King James in the NBA. Now instead of him being like some king in some tribe in Ghana or something, or I don't know what his 21andMe thing has shown with his genetics. But instead of that, now he's a king here because of the colonization of history. So maybe that's kind of what they're saying. If it wasn't for colonization's effect on global philosophy, then we'd have a different dominant philosophy in the world. But then, no. This is like I'm trying to be rational with these things. But then if you take out for me to try to the things I'm trying to base this on is with the assumptions that they don't have, where there's nothing like objective truth. So the only thing objective is oppression. So there's actually objectives where I think part of why I really like philosophy is because philosophy is philosophy. It's kind of it's almost mathematical in the sense where it is what it is. It's people observing what it is. That's why I can come to a certain observation about certain interactions, and then I find out that this great thinker from 50 years ago wrote a whole book on that.
Yeah.
When that happens, I'm not like, I can't believe I didn't know this before. It's more like, wow, we were witnessing the same reality, so it makes sense that they eventually saw what I was seeing because that's what we're viewing. Like, if I see an elephant here, and I'm the first person to see an elephant, and I describe the elephant, and then I find out that elephants have been existing in India, and people have wrote books about how to raise elephants. I don't all of a sudden think I should have known before. It's like, no, I just hadn't seen the elephant, but we're both seeing the same creature, so it makes some sense.
Yeah.
These people, some of these people, not all of them. Well, yeah, I don't know. So.
Because, to continue it, science relies on the correspondence theory of truth. It's, okay, do these facts conform to the facts of reality? And the whole purpose of science is that it doesn't matter who's doing it. You as a black man can do an experiment. I can do it. A trans Middle Eastern person, whatever you want to come up with, can do it. The whole point is that it corresponds with the facts of reality, and it's the methodology itself. Anyone can do it. Anyone can disprove experiments. And if you're just going to say, well, it's valuable based on who does it, then what? Okay, we have to take bad experiments just because the person is of a certain ethnic background. It makes no sense.
Yeah. And it's one thing I wonder, what is their, do they actually give any propositions where they say, if we actually succeeded at decolonizing history in this postcolonial theory idea, what is the hypothesis that they have with this? Like, what is the result when they say, after we've done this, after we've taken out the effect of, after we've entered this reality that's free from the negative effects that came from postcolonial theory, what do they think the social landscape looks like? What do they think philosophy looks like once it's been decolonized? Do they actually give any objective descriptions or ideas of what that would be like?
That's the thing. They don't seem to. And then I've even asked other people one-on-one, what is your purpose here? And they just say things like, I'm spreading awareness or something like that. It's just like, okay, we can learn about colonialism and the negative impacts of it, sure, but that doesn't mean throw out everything that was contributed. That's backwards, not forwards.
Yeah, and that's a question to anybody listening, whether you are an advocate of postcolonial theory, whether you agree with what we're saying, or you're just here to hear the stuff. If you've heard somebody else, or if you personally are somebody that advocates for this and has some kind of objective things where you think if we didn't have this anymore, kind of just like a simple thing where I'm like, if you stopped eating certain foods, you would be healthier due to X, Y, Z. So you need to kind of take this out of your diet. That's the kind of thing where I'm thinking, like, why should we care? Or why should we decolonize these things? Because I think if you'd say that, what in your mind you have as a positive thing, like somebody who believes would say, a Christian would say, if you stop doing all these things that are against the Ten Commandments, then in the future you will be closer to God and live a happier life because you'll be following these rules, and then eventually you'll get to heaven after death. That kind of objective thing, that's kind of what I'm trying to see. Is there something where it's like, if you want bigger chest muscles, you go and you eat this amount of protein and you take this out of your diet and you make sure you go to the gym because of this. That's kind of the questions that I know it's not your job to educate me, but I'm asking if you can inform me about these things or point me in the right direction. That'd be much appreciated.
Well, because you remember there was that meme going around. James Lindsay shared it a few times about decolonized math, and it shows a crashed plane, and it says 2 + 2 = 5, and you almost wonder. It's like, what other alternatives are you, like? What is your alternative? I mean, how do you think the world is going to look different? How do you think? The other point I was going to add too is that, given our views, if we have a society that has absolute freedom, you can live in the way you want. If you want to live without reason, you want to eat what you want to pray to animistic gods, go ahead. But then people are going to look at that and say, okay, what does that produce, and then is that valuable? And if you're living in a hut, you're subject to diseases that you don't have immunity from, all that. I mean, that's not really forwards; it's backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough story. Oh, yeah, keep on.
Again, anyone feel free to contribute. But so what's interesting here too, I was reading that not everyone took the postmodern approach to postcolonialism. For example, there's a Indian scholar, Mira Nanda, who actually argues that we should use science and reason. My understanding is that what she was doing had more to do with how the British impacted India as far as giving preferential treatment to certain groups. Some groups had more power over others, all that. And her analysis had to do with overturning that, but at the same time, let's use science, let's use reason, let's acknowledge that these things are effective and do matter, and then from that we can figure out, okay, how can India be better run or more fair? So then, just sort of wrap up a few final points here. This was way more radical than what postmodernism originally even called for. I mean, it's been applied to everything from hairstyles, literature and curricula, statues, history. Of course, I would say some of the worst is the attacks on individualism, but also on science and reason. I mean, you attack reason, you're just undermining civilization. The other really dangerous point here, and you sort of touched on this earlier, but I wanted to elaborate, is the cultural relativist aspect of it. And the authors, for example, talk about feminists, LGBT activists, and secular liberals in the Islamic world, for example, how there are people who want to bring about reform there, but they've either been silenced or at least threatened into silence, and a lot of them are afraid to speak up because what's going to happen to them. And when we say that, we usually get two answers. One is that if we criticize those countries, well, we're just viewing them through a Western lens, or that's imposing our outside perspective. Or the other thing that they tend to do is they say, well, these behaviors are the legacy of colonialism. But then the problem with this, of course, is they stop with that assertion and they don't examine further. But in the case of the Middle East, you can't really make that argument, because if you think about it, like, Constantinople fell in 1453, and the Ottoman Empire ruled that whole area up until the end of a little after World War I. So you figure 500 years under Islamic rule, that has nothing to do with the Western powers. I mean, there was trade and diplomacy and all that, but as far as we know, those countries weren't ruled by the West. I mean, they were all under the Ottoman Empire. And the thing is, too, is that the Islamists even cite the Quran as justification for this. Oh, women are supposed to wear these outfits. Women are supposed to have this status because our book says so. They don't cite Aristotle, Plato, all that. They cite their holy books. So that criticism just doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, probably just goes in. It just goes along with that whole thing. Like, you approach the white guy first, that means you're favoring the white guy.
Yeah.
You approach the black guy first. That's because you're afraid the black guy wandering around your store alone. It's this, they're trying to get to that main goal, so they're going to find the information that leads them to that and ignore everything else that doesn't. And it's frustrating. But it is what it is. That's.
But I would also take the moral high ground here and say we want these people to have voices because we care about the people who suffer in those countries. I mean, as we've talked about a number of occasions, I mean, people complain about homophobia here, but I mean, you don't get pride parades in Middle Eastern countries. There was even the whole thing about how, I forget if it was Blizzard or one of those gaming companies, they wouldn't even do the rainbow flag for their Middle Eastern branches because they knew the backlash it would get.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, if I had to be a gay man, I know I'd rather be here than Saudi Arabia for sure. You know?
That's one thing I've asked all sorts of people. Just if you were a minority of any sort, which are the countries? What are the top 3 to 5 countries you'd want to live in as a minority of any category that you find you identify with? If you were a minority within that category, which country would you want to live in? The top 5.
Yeah.
I think for most of you, you'll find out you're thinking of Western countries. So I'm not saying that doesn't mean that they can't be improved. In fact, let me stop saying that, because I feel like when you say that, oh, you have to keep saying I'm not saying. No, I said what I said. If you want to misquote me and then say, oh, do you mean that there's no issues? Did I say that? No, I didn't say that. I don't have to tell you that I didn't say that. I'm going to stop having to add that whole apology of things or just hedging myself. No, I said what I said. You want to edit it out of context and just focus on that part alone, have at it. Okay.
So
was that it with postcolonialism?
Just a few points to wrap up here. You know, as I said before, they're just starting with the conclusion they want, looking for things to justify it. When they can't, they either make things up or they cherry pick things to fit the conclusion. You know, you can speak more on this than I can, obviously, but I don't think people in formerly colonized countries want to give up all the things the West contributed. I mean, I don't think people in developing countries want to give up Western medicine, science, media, all that. I really doubt that. I mean, I don't want to speak for other people, but I can easily say that okay, they know their quality of life would decline, would plummet immediately if all those things disappeared. And it's funny because I don't have the audiobook version of this, but apparently Helen Pluckrose reads it with her British accent, and the chapter ends with, there's little reason to believe that previous colonized people have used for post-colonial studies, that she talks about Western medicine things, and then she ends with, that confronts France and the United States about their understanding of big black butts. And then she provides a link. That was actually an article about, oh, the Westerners view the black figure in this way and all that.
And these people say that at the same point, some of those race people will look at like old Western statues, and the females are like, oh, what are you talking about? Fat acceptance. You're talking about all these same things. Look in the past. Women were all round and shapely, even in the West. Like, no. First of all, in some of those cases, this is something that I think some people should know. Some of them, society actually was protecting women in the sense where you couldn't just get a female model. It was considered immodest for a female to model for an artist. So what they do, male models were okay. So the model would be male, and then they just do bolt-on tits on them. That's why you see some of those sculptures where it's like a rather boxy female, and then just has these kind of things like you cut 2 grapefruits in half and just plop them on a male's chest. You'll see some statues do that a lot more, but that's why you see some of those beefier sort of females. It wasn't just the Amazon. There weren't like there was a bunch of Amazons walking around. It's because those sculptors were using male models, and they just tried to add some.
You heard this story about the Mona Lisa. Some people think that was Leonardo da Vinci in drag. That he.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be impossible. He was gay, actually, too. They say. So
I wouldn't be surprised if it was. Like as I mentioned, it seriously was considered immodest. Yeah. Yes, there were still probably some prostitutes, ladies of the night, but it wasn't the thing where women were really being used. Were part of the artistic community in that sense. There was a time when it became rather taboo for women to do that. A woman from any, so it wasn't like you could just be like, oh, we have a maid, let's do it. Even an artist it was considered to be improper to even ask a maid or even ask a lower class female to do it. So it just wasn't allowed. So that's this. Another thing about just the different understandings of perceptions of what we think society has been. There's limitations for men, those limitations for women for various reasons that we don't necessarily all understand anymore. And some of the things exist right now that we don't understand.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. I mean, that wraps up post-colonial studies. Did you have any finishing thoughts or comments or anything?
No, I mean, it was just a thing where, again, I'm asking again if somebody can see a place where they point out why they think this should be done, because I'm thinking, in general, I have certain thoughts of things that I think would be preferable to do, but if I was advocating it and trying to get any one of you to actually go along with me to do that, like we've mentioned several times, if I was having this conversation with Stephen, there'd be no reason to really record it. Yeah, okay, maybe like there'd be no reason to really record. But if I'm recording it and I'm saying I'm recording it, and I would like you to watch these hours of conversations, I've gone to several times, kind of saying like, we think this is the problem because it's being taught in society, it's being taught in governments, it's not really accurate to what the reality is. Problems occur because of how we define X rather than what X is. So I think the more knowledge we have about what X is, the better way to address those things and adjust and act and create a better world for all of us. So I think getting this information is positive for me, having this conversation, and then that's why I think if you listen to this and you had a more accurate idea of what this is, you'd have a better time even just simply like me with Anita Sarkeesian saying that, and it not just rattling around in my brain like, what does she mean? What is she seeing that I'm not seeing? Now that I know she's coming from that postmodernist thing, I can hear that. And somebody says that, and it just says in my mind as it's something that somebody wrote, where it's like, if I see a book and there's like Vlad Dracula, and it's like, oh, I don't want to eat, I want your blood. If somebody just randomly said that, I'd be like, what is this person talking about blood? But in the book, in the context, it's a vampire. So I understand it's a vampire. So it doesn't really go around in my head and bother me like, what's this? It's a vampire. That's what vampires do. so that's the thing. That's my only conclusion. Again, a request. If you've seen somebody explain why they think we should decolonize these things, if somebody has actually explained something rather objective and clear to say that you should value post-colonial theory, because if we followed what was done in this and decolonized these things and removed the effect of what they think they have observed in post-colonial theory, the world would be better in this way. If someone has done that, that's good. And my last caveat to that is, if there is something that is objectively bad, I don't really have to give a result. Like if somebody's like, oh, I'm hitting my kids to raise them, like, don't hit your kids. Then tell me what else I have to do. I don't have to tell you what else to do because objectively hitting your kid is bad. That's a violation of an aggression principle, using force and things like that. Like I can say that's bad, you should stop it. Don't assault that woman. Don't spit on this person. Yeah. Don't break that thing. I don't have to tell you something else. So if you want to say it's just a case where you're just identifying something negative and it needs to be stopped, that's well and good. But I would prefer when it comes to actions, when it comes to saying, I want you to do something else. And that's what these post-colonial theory people are saying. They want me, Stephen, and the rest of us out here to accept what they're doing and act on it. I think it helps when there's like, do this because of this and this and that. I don't know if there's anything else.
I've been trying to come up with an analogy to describe this, but I feel like what they're doing, it's like a more extreme version of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like it's almost more like burning down the whole house because there's one problem with it or something.
Yeah.
And it just shows a real lack of follow through, because to me it would be like, if you're going to destroy a certain house, okay, you have to figure out, where am I staying in the meantime? Is something going to be built in its place? How is that going to go? All that. But if it's just, I don't like the way things are, burn it down, what happens in the meantime? Oh, don't worry about it. It's like, well, no, you need somewhere to stay, something to do. And I've had that sort of similar conversation with some people regarding the police, because they'll complain about the police and they'll say, well, just get rid of them. I said, okay, well, what do you offer in return? They say, oh, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out. And it's like, well, no, because if they're all gone, you're going to have crime, you're going to have other things, and if it's, oh, you can't have guns, we can only have certain guns, you can't form a security force, all that. Well, no, you need a solution. You can't just throw out what's here, and that's ultimately one of my problems. Yes, we can and we should criticize what's here, but I mean, there's actually a black feminist thinker. Her name is Audre Lorde, and she actually wrote an essay, and she talked about we can't use the master's tools to tear down the master's house. And of course, that's obviously a reference to slavery. But her reasoning was that, it was later elaborated, we can't use reason and things like that. But then the question becomes, okay, what are you going to build your house with? It's easy to tear down a house, but you have to have something to take its place. You can't just destroy what's here and hope for the best.
Yeah.
So again, if you have an idea about how to build a new house, what it would be like, all that, feel free to chime in. But in the meantime, I'm sticking with what we have. Yeah.
And with something actually practical, it's recently something from Minneapolis that was where George Floyd ended up passing on in that incident with the cop and Derek Chauvin. And the Minnesota City Council, I think a few city council members that did come out and say they were progressive or Marxist or whatnot, but they started that whole defund the police thing. And I just saw a news article from today or a few days ago, within the last couple of days, where the same Minnesota council people are saying, they literally were like, where are the police? They were having a meeting with someone who was in charge of the police in that area, and they were saying literally, like, where are the police? And the guy was like, look, 100 people, since you did this whole defund the police thing, 100 people have left. 100 of the police officers have left. And that is twice as much as is on average during these times. And now they're saying, there's a spike in crime. Where are the police? We need to fund the police more. So there is that aspect to it. And with my mention of the peaceful parenting thing, part of my frustration with that topic is a topic that I feel like engaging on whenever I see it coming up. I did start a different series, like a playlist I have, Hands Up, Don't Hit, where there's different things that go into like the data of why it's negative, and some of those videos do contain some of the content about like other possible ways to do certain things. So that's the thing. So even a repository like that, if somebody can say, this is the thing, this is the place, those are things that I'm willing to look into. I'm not promising any actual direct review of discussion of it. But again, if you have, this is a problem, this is why it's bad, we can stop it in this way. And if we stop it, this is what will happen. Those are the kind of things that I'd like to see in a layman's terms. Don't give me the in a way that I can understand. I'm not like the smartest human being ever. So just something like I can understand. Yeah.
All right, that's it for me. That's all I have.
Sure. Okay. So we need to stop this recording here. This is going to post this part as an entire section in itself. Then Steven's going to stay on. We'll talk about recording the next part of this. And even if we don't post this right next, the next part is going to be, you said it was critical race theory and intersectional feminism, was it?
Just intersectionality in general.
And intersectionality. So that is going to be the next section that we're going to be talking about. And thank you very much again for coming along with us in this conversation and taking your time to listen to what we have to say about this. And I hope you join us for the rest. And if you haven't listened to the other parts, you can go and actually listen to those if you're just listening to as we've posted this one. This is going to be at least number 3 in this series. I think it's going to be number 3 because I'm going to do the postmodernism conversation on itself, then the first introductory part, and then this is going to be number 3. So there's at least 2 parts out there if you're listening to this one right now, and possibly more if we've already posted the ones coming after this. Anything else you want to say to close this section up?
It's a good conversation.
Right.
Hope you all enjoy it.
All right. So goodbye, Stephen. You stay on.